Look at the dog. He falls asleep like that. Are you tired?
I'm bringing the truck into the garage next to the Impala, but it's too crowded in here, so I'm building a new workbench to get some stuff out of the way. But the bench needs to fulfill some requirements. So, first, it needs to house a lot of automotive specific parts like AN hose fittings. Second, it needs to be sturdy enough to hold my vise and arbor press, which I use often. But I didn't want to just use your typical large tool cabinet like what you can buy at a hardware store. It needed to have deep drawers and a usable workbench top that I could beat on. Man, this garage is such a mess. I am so glad it is getting cleaned up. When we first moved in, I wanted everything planned out, but it was in the middle of the pandemic and we just had to get everything moved in. So I threw everything in its spot and I've been chipping away at organization ever since. I built this little bench back here in the corner from remnants of a project that I used to call Mega Bench. I made that video years ago, but at the time I thought everyone needed a big, huge workbench. So I made Mega Bench with a massive butcher block top, and it was supposed to serve as an assembly bench and an outfeed table and a welding station and all these different things, which it did, but I just ended up cluttering it up all the time, and it took up nearly as much space as a car. I have about 450 square feet of usable space in the car area and another 200 square feet in the wood shop area. Altogether, it's bigger than my old garage, but still quite small for all the things that I do in here. I use the back corner quite a bit to assemble AN hoses, wiring looms, as well as to fabricate brackets and small aluminum and steel parts, and to thread holes and press things. But my vise hasn't been bolted down, so it moves and shifts around while I'm working. I decided I should fix this vise problem and consolidate a lot of these things into this back corner to make it more organized. In the course of doing so, I shall declutter this garage and maybe make enough room to pull the truck in here. Finally, I've had this vision of a bench that would have a lot of variably sized drawers that are big and deep and wide. I'd have commonly used tools up top and an inventory of fittings and electrical tools in the bottom. I like the idea of a broad, stable base, and I'll put lifting casters on it so I can move it around when I need to. I went to Home Depot to get some materials, and while plywood prices have declined, they're still not cheap. I just love it at Home Depot when people park their carts sideways across the aisle so that nobody can get by. It's great. Just look at this. I eventually spent all of my money and loaded up the muscle truck with my parts to bring them home. But when I brought it home, I couldn't back into the garage because I'd blocked the alley, just like those doofuses at Home Depot. So I set up the loading area close to the truck so I could slide it out of the truck. I got one of those Bora centipede things, and it works great. It's better than sawhorses. I have one sheet of 3/4 inch birch and 2 sheets of 1/2 inch plywood. The 1/2 inch plywood will be used for the drawer boxes. I probably could have used 2 sheets of 3/4 inch birch, but I was trying to save a little money, and so that's why I'm relying mostly on the 1/2 inch plywood to build the rest of the drawer boxes. I have another sheet of 3/4 inch pine that I'll use here sparingly, and you'll see how. Now for the assembly. I could just build this bench like a typical cabinet with a carcass, but I need it to be really sturdy because I'm going to put a lot of weight on it and a lot of weight in it, and I'm going to be beating on it. I started with ripping down these 2x4s for the base. They're not ideal for fine woodworking, but for this project, I wanted a strong spine and keep it from sagging when the casters lift the bench up. I ripped these 2x4s down to remove the rounded edges and make square surfaces to put it all together. Then I assembled the spine of the base by running long deck screws through the front and into the short side pieces. I wanted to build the base first so I could visualize it in the corner. Then I got started on prepping the back corner. The first thing I'm doing here is removing all of these banister pieces for the stairs. But by replacing these banister pieces with a flat piece of plywood, I could then extend the French cleats to that wall and give myself that much more storage. I purchased some cheap whitewood boards, and here I am ripping a 45-degree bevel on them and storing them for later. Now I was able to rip cross cuts into these sheets with the track saw, which will save me a lot of work when it comes time to rip them on the table saw. But then I was able to move some of the tools over to the new French cleat wall. Using the track saw, I ripped down sections of the 3/4 inch birch plywood to make the sides and back of the workbench, and these will be joined together with pocket hole screws. Ripping the plywood with the track saw made it so much easier to manhandle the plywood pieces onto the table saw. I'm all about reducing physical effort and making things simpler and safer in the shop because as I get older, I get clumsier and sloppier. I drilled pocket holes on the interior surface of the backboard for the bench carcass, and these holes will guide screws into the bench sides, which will also be screwed directly into the 2x4 base for added rigidity. The rest of the carcass will be built with pocket hole joinery. On the center divider, I should have taken a lot more time to create perfectly equal length story sticks for either side of it, but instead I took measurements from each side and marked the middle and then split the difference between the two marks, which probably could have been done better. When you use pocket hole screws, you have to watch the joint very carefully while you run the screw in because it can sometimes shift the joint ever so slightly as the screw makes contact with the biting surface. When I assembled the center section, I had two equal length upper cabinet rails separating and supporting the midsection, and I drilled offset pocket holes so that they would not run into each other, and this worked out great. At the top of the cabinet and these rails, the center divider was perfectly centered, but at the bottom it was slightly off because of the reason I explained earlier. I'm using lifting casters, which will be mounted to the side of the bench, and they come with long, heavy gauge screws that can bite deep into the structure. But in this case, I didn't want to use screws. Instead, I wanted to have bolts going entirely through the wall of the structure so that it would have lots of support and wouldn't have risk of tearing out. To make it easier, I turned the bench up on one end so I could locate the holes for the casters, and here I am pre-drilling the holes, then prepping the bolts and lug nuts. The bottom hole goes straight through the 2x4 base, so it will be very sturdy. It will be through bolted in the base, so it will lift the whole bench with the base and not just with the sidewall. Each caster can support something like 100 pounds each, so this should be strong enough to support the weight of the entire bench. I measured the cabinet for a recessed floor, which will keep the base frame from racking in the diagonal direction and will provide another perpendicular surface for the center divider to screw into. Using the track saw, I was able to break down the remainder of the 3/4 inch pine plywood and rip it to width in the table saw. I test fit it in the bench and then shaved a little more off the end with the track saw until it would fit. This divider will be secured by the top rails, the rear panel, the base frame, and the base floor, and then eventually it will be secured to the bench top, making it the only load-bearing section that connects to all main structural surfaces. Look at these. I ordered these off Amazon. Described as 18/8 stainless, yet they're black. Now, why would you paint stainless black? Unless it's not actually stainless. Now I could finish off mounting all of the lifting casters bolted through the base and the sidewall together. With all of the casters mounted, I could take it for a test drive.
Yeah.
Each of the casters lifts with just a step on the lever. Now, I'm going to show you some B-roll of me creating a butcher block top. I'm going to tell you right now that this is not the top I'm going to use for this bench. So why am I showing it to you? Well, I'll tell you why. Because if you wanted to build a butcher block top for your workbench, this is how you would do it. But for my application, this isn't going to work for me. And I figured this out as I was building this bench top. I was in the middle making the workbench, and I was thinking that this workbench is pretty nice for my dirty workshop. It's not as nice as some of the pieces of furniture I've made, but it's too nice for the garage. But I was thinking I should go all out and make this workbench really cool, and a butcher block top would be just the thing. And it would help me use up a bunch of wood scraps so I can clean up my wood rack. So it'd be a win-win, right? So I started in on that process. Now I've made probably half a dozen butcher block tops for pieces of furniture and workbenches over the last 10 years, and there are a lot of different ways to do them. In some pieces, I've used biscuits to keep the pieces aligned, and other times I've used pocket hole screws on larger, flatter pieces of wood with and without glue. And in a number of other pieces, I've just used glue and only glue. I've done that for workbenches and desks and TV stands and buffet tables and all kinds of stuff. And I've learned that glue by itself is actually really strong if you smear it uniformly between the pieces and you leave it clamped overnight. But about halfway through this process, I started to realize if I was going to bolt down my vise and my arbor press, it started to bother me that I would potentially split the bench top at the joints because I'd be introducing a stress that would want to pull my glue pieces apart. At first, I was kind of in denial of this. Like a little voice in my head was saying, hey, this is going to split. And the other side of me was like, no, it's not. It'll be fine. But after a while, I started thinking that it was definitely going to split. But I'd already started, so I decided to follow through. And then I could just enjoy the process of making a butcher block top, which can actually be really satisfying. But there was going to be a lot of sanding, which can be really annoying and tedious. So I used this bench top as another excuse, which I'll get to in a moment. I've been wanting to invest in a better sanding system for some time, and this project gave me the perfect excuse to spend way more money than I should be on a Festool HEPA sander. Now, I just justified this investment because the last time I made a butcher block top for a TV stand, I broke out in hives and I had a severe allergic reaction to the sawdust. I've never had that happen before in my entire life, but I did on that project. I never want to have those itchy hives again, so I consider this investment to be worthwhile. Plus, I'm really tired of having sawdust all over my car projects and my metalworking projects, and I really need to start managing it better. So I glued this butcher block top up in two sections and I cut them down to approximately the same length. I glued them while on construction paper, so some of the paper was stuck to the bottom of the glued sections, but that's okay because the planer is going to take care of that. As I was making this butcher block top, I was doing a lot of thinking because a process like this is kind of meditative. I'm kind of in the zone while I'm sanding and I'm thinking about where I'd put this top when it's done. Again, I had that little voice in my head telling me that I should make this into something cool. And so I started gestating the idea that instead of this workbench, it'd be better for an outfeed table. My table saw is the same Ryobi BT3100 that I've had for over a decade, which I bought used for $200 a long time ago. I've built a table saw and a cabinet for it, and I've put this big Bessemeyer fence on it, and it served me really well. But I've had a number of little accidents over the years. Luckily, none of them too serious. And I'm thinking as I get older, I'm going to have more accidents, and maybe I just need a safer table saw setup. I'm a klutz, like a really bad one. I hurt myself all the time, and I run into stuff and knock stuff over, and I've gotten enough scars on my hands to prove it. I'm kind of a putz. So I'm not buying it right now, and I'm going to take some time to save up for it. But my plan is to redo my whole table saw setup with a saw stop and a shorter fence and a nice outfeed table with this butcher block top. And underneath that outfeed table will be a much better dust collection setup than I presently have. So there is a plan here. Just to prove to you that I am a klutz, I dropped my vise while I was moving this workbench and I broke it. This was yet another distraction for this project. The vise fell on the floor and broke this little piece on the front that holds the threaded rod in place. And without that piece, the threaded rod just doesn't work and the vise jaws don't open. This is terrible because this vise is very special. It belonged to my wife's grandfather, and my father-in-law restored this when my wife and I got married, and he gave it to me. So it's a terrible thing that this broke, and I must repair it to an as good or better condition than it was before. I found a piece of scrap steel, and I cut out a piece that approximates the shape and size of this little cast iron half moon that was there previously. But it's going to require some milling to make it all work. Could have CNC'd this, but it actually wasn't perfectly symmetrical, and the lines weren't perfectly lined up. I just ended up cutting it by hand with an angle grinder. And that actually worked out pretty well. I needed to sand this edge a few times to get the radius just right, but it came out pretty nice. And then I countersunk the mounting holes to receive the stainless hardware that my father-in-law originally used. My father-in-law is also a fan of hammer finished paints, so I tried matching the hammer finished gray that was already on this vise. One thing I didn't show you is that I needed to mill the inner radius of the half moon ever so slightly so that it would seat properly. So back to the butcher block. I told you I'm a klutz and I need more safety in my workshop, and the way to do that is rebuild a lot of my tool stations and my processes such that using safer equipment is easy, because that's the only way that I'm ever going to actually do it. Before buying the Festool sander, I tried to save myself some money and rig up a shop vac with my old DeWalt, and it just didn't work, like at all. Like it sucked in a bad way. The DeWalt doesn't have holes in the sanding pads, so wood glue can get gummed up on the paper and then it overheats and wears out the paper really quickly. The vac attachment doesn't do anything to suck any of the dust away, and if dust does get sucked up, it's just because it was right next to it. It doesn't really pull any of it in. Now, I chopped the end of the table to length. I took a moment to look at it and admire it. I bought this Festool thing, which is the first large Festool investment I've ever made. If you can't tell, I am not a woodshop tool snob. I've got cheap Ryobi tools all over the place. The Festool toolboxes, I think they're called sustainers. I thought those were kind of stupid, but once I saw how they work, I'm like, these are actually pretty awesome. Of course, now I have to buy extra expensive Festool sanding pads and keep them in this fancy sustainer, but I guess that's the price of highly effective dust collection.
This is incredible. This continues. Look at that. I just did this for 10 minutes. There's nothing on the pad. I go through pads much faster on my old one because they just gum up. They get so much stuff on there. The fact that the vacuum is working so well, it keeps the stuff from building up on the pad. That's nice. Didn't expect that.
There is way less dust getting stuck on the sanding pad now, though, and the sanding pad doesn't really have any hot spots. So the sanding paper seems to last quite a bit longer, like 2 to 3 times longer. So there could be some potential savings in that. I did get out my handheld router and round over the edges of the butcher block top so that when I run pieces off the table saw, they won't get caught on the outfeed table edge. You can see a little bit of snipe in the butcher block top from the planer. I spent a little more time with the sander after that trying to smooth that out. After all that work and deciding not to use the butcher block top for this bench, I opted for a much simpler solution. Here I am ripping down some pieces of 3/4 inch plywood that I will use as structural stringers to keep the top of the workbench tied together. Using pocket holes, I'm screwing these into the front, back, and sides and the center divider of the workbench frame. This ties all the structure together on top and prevents diagonal racking just like it did in the base. And I picked up a piece of 3/4 inch oak plywood because it is a hardwood and it will take some beating. And I'm going to bolt some heavy tools through this top, so I need something that won't split. Using the track saw again, I rip it to length and then I rip it to width on the table saw. And with a quick test fit, it looks like it will serve just fine as a bench top. Plus, it's replaceable.
It went through in 2020 when we were really like pushing forward and doing everything we could to
Get it.
when that thing happened, we had enough money for it.
Get it.
How do you feel about him? This guy that sent you that letter.
I screwed through the stringers into the bottom of the bench top so that it is secured without any visible screws, and with the bench top in place and the recessed solid bottom, as well as all of the secured connections between the center divider and the back wall, bottom floor, top rails, and now the top, the bench carcass is very rigid. So I'm going to build these drawers with a 3/4 inch birch bottom. I'm going to build the sides and front and back of the drawer around the perimeter of that bottom. So the bottom will be recessed, the sides will be attached to it. The shear strength of the screws and nails will be responsible for bearing the weight of any load that's in the drawer. The quickest way to do this is you got one side, another side, and each of the drawer slides that are taking up the width of the cavity. And so this should be my drawer bottom width, which is 28 7/8. All the drawer fronts are cut. 2 sets of 7-inch drawer sides are cut, and 2 sets of 4-inch drawer sides are cut. He's going to help me. We're going to see where we are. What do we have left? Now I cut the drawer bottoms by subtracting the thickness of the sides and the drawer slides from the width of the opening. The drawer boxes will have a 3/4 inch thick bottom and 1/2 inch thick side walls. This is why I built the drawers around a 3/4 inch thick bottom, because I can glue and nail the drawer side walls to the bottom and then drop the front and rear drawer faces between the walls onto the bottom, and then glue and nail through the wall into the edge of the drawer face as well as through the bottom into the drawer face, which creates a strong joint that resists pull out from multiple directions. I can do this very quickly, and it makes a strong drawer once the glue dries. I stacked them up as I completed them and ended up with this tower. Then I could assemble the drawers on the drawer slides, and I usually do this by spacing the drawers from the bottom using 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch plywood scraps. Okay, to keep things simple, I usually run the drawer slides either along the bottom edge or the top edge of the drawer, just because I don't like to try to perfectly center them or anything like that. It's just easier just to use one of these as a reference. What I'm going to do is use the top edge as the reference line. So for the bottom drawers, I'm making a little block as a jig. This will help me mount this so that all of these are running along the top edge. I'll give myself just a little bit of clearance here and mark this off. I'll be able to use this block to mount all these drawer slides parallel to the bottom of the carcass. So now I've got the drawer slides mounted, and now I'm going to mount the drawer itself. You can see that the drawer slides are just about right at the top of the drawer. I've got a 3/4 inch board underneath each side, so it's spacing it off the floor of the carcass. I've got the drawer slides partially extended out here so that I can put my first screw in. The drawer slide itself is just shy of the flush surface of the face of the drawer, so when I put my drawer faces on, they won't interfere. And when they close, they should be just a little bit proud of this edge of the carcass, which will give me enough room to put some trim here. For mounting the drawer slides, I usually use these screws. These are little 3/4 inch screws. I like them because the head is small, and so it mounts flush relatively easily without interfering with the function of the drawer slide. This gives me enough gap between the drawers to keep them from interfering with each other. Some of you have commented that with all this noise in the shop, the dog seems unfazed. Well, that's because he can't hear. This is our dog Bacon, and he was born deaf. We recently lost our other dog, Darwin, who you've seen in some other videos. He was nearly 19 years old, and he had slowly lost his hearing as well. I was saving the topmost drawer for last because I had calculated the spacing to leave me just enough room to have a thin or shallow upper drawer, but I wanted to see how everything would lay out before finalizing the top drawer. The good thing about making drawers this way is that you can actually rip them in the table saw and cut them down to the final depth, which is what I ended up doing. I wanted some nice drawer fronts, and I was going to use some nice quarter sawn oak and maple that I had in my lumber rack, but on second thought, I decided to save those for a nicer furniture project. So I made a trip to the hardware store in the muscle truck for some basic 3/4 inch oak boards. I cut these boards to width in the miter saw using my stop block system, and then I needed to test the placement of the drawers and make sure that I had everything evenly spaced. The trick with drawer fronts is to cover up all of the plywood and unattractive materials you use for the drawer boxes. I tested their fit using clamps, and then I ripped the drawer faces down for the thinner drawers. Then I used a roundover bit and my router table to smooth out the edges. This is an important step because in my opinion, it makes the drawer fronts look more structural. I could have left the edges sharp such that the fronts are all joined together like a uniform slab, and that could work too, whatever floats your boat. So the technique I used for installing the fronts is as follows. First, I put a 1/2 inch spacer underneath so that I have a uniform gap with the drawer beneath it, and I marked the back of the drawer face so that it is evenly spaced in the drawer box. I held the drawer face in place with clamps while I did this. Then I took the clamps off. I lined up the face with the drawer closed, and I shot 2 finished nails through the face of the drawer to hold it in place temporarily. Then I could double check the action of the drawer, make sure everything was lined up, and then I could insert screws from the back of the drawer face to hold the face in place. Then I built a jig for drawer pulls. This jig is very simple to construct. First, I used a small piece of wood and then placed the drawer pull on the face to line up with the holes for the drawer pull. This doesn't make any sense at all the way I'm saying this. First, I used a small piece of wood and placed the drawer pull on this small piece of wood and drilled the holes through the drawer pull into this piece of wood. I lined up the center line of this piece of wood with the center line of the drawer face, and that way I could have centered holes for the drawer pulls. So I attached a piece of scrap wood to this piece of wood like an arm, and then I lined up a stop with the edge of the drawer on the left side. This way I could just line up the stop with each drawer and it would place my holes in the center of each drawer face. Now before I put the drawer pulls on, I'm going to do a quick sanding of the entire bench, and then I'm going to spray the entire bench with a light coat of polyurethane. I used the Festool sander for this, and it was marvelous. It generated hardly any dust, and when it came time to apply the poly, I had hardly anything to clean from the surface. Usually I have to wipe it down after sanding. I did give it a quick spray of compressed air though, but again, hardly any dust was on the surface. I made an effort to knock down the edges around the drawer face and the edges of the drawer boxes where I might have some touch points, which keeps me from getting splinters later. I used spray poly because it's fast and I'm not looking for a deep, thick coat on this. It's going to get beat up and I'm okay with that. This poly brings out the wood grain and it makes the project look more finished. And here we are with all of the drawer pulls installed. The vise is also functional again, and I've got a dedicated spot for my arbor press. Overall, I'm very happy with how this turned out. I love these drawer pulls. They look like library card holders, but I can put a piece of paper in each drawer pull, identifying what is in the drawer. This helps me stay more organized and keep stuff off the workbenches. And this is what I built this for. Now I can store my AN fittings and get a lot of stuff out of the way. The lifting casters work great and are doing well despite the weight of the bench. Most of the time it will sit on its base, flat and sturdy. Overall, I hope you enjoyed riding along for this project. I know the Impala isn't running yet and the truck has plenty of work to do, but I needed to get this project done before I could devote some time to those.
I thought I was going to be smart and have it on the corner so that I could rotate it over here, I could rotate it over here, and I'd have plenty of room to work. That will work okay, but it's actually very handy to have it overhang off the side of the workbench to some degree, because sometimes you have stuff that's in the vise that needs to hang down and the bench top is just in the way. Same with this. I didn't really want there to be too much hanging off the side of the bench. The drawers are in the way, but I really don't have a choice. That turns out to be a pretty useful alignment. I could see all the way through here. I could drop a post down through there. I could drop things through here and they hang off on the side of the bench.
Speaking of the truck, join me in the next few videos where I finally fix the stance. The truck has been scraping since I got it and I'm finally correcting that. I'm able to do that because this bench is tucked nicely in the back. It allows me to move the lift over and bring the truck into the second bay. I can even get it on the lift now. I am so pumped. More on that in the next video. This is David Hill with Solve Fix Build. Thanks for watching.